geometry at a very young age. And typically, we don't learn geometry until secondary. And so oftentimes, there may be a flip-flop of what skills were learned when. So keeping that in mind with mathematics, that you can't assume that a student has the same math skills as somebody who's gone to school in the United States. Estimating, rounding in geometry may or may not be taught as early in other countries, in other cultures. I think what I've been getting feedback on is that geometry is taught more often at younger levels in other countries, although that may not be the case. Mathematical terms don't always translate well. So if you tell a kid to round and then you tell them to go look it up in the dictionary, they're going to find something really different for round than what you necessarily mean in terms of changing the number to the next closest number. So making sure that you're aware of the fact that just because you tell a student to look up a mathematical term in the dictionary doesn't mean it's going to translate into what they can understand. And then mental math may be the norm for a lot of students. I had a student named Pavel who came to the United States when he was 16 from Belarus and didn't speak English. He spoke like 4 or 5 other languages, but not English. And so he gets into math, and he had been going to a college for mathematics and physics in his country. So the highest math that my school had was AP Calculus, and so they said, well, we'll just put him in AP Calc, because he has to take math to graduate, and that's the highest math we have, and he doesn't speak English, so at least he'll learn those concepts in English. So this kid was doing entire calculus problems in his head, like something that would take somebody a couple pages. He could just like come up with the answer. And so what happened was, he finally came to me and he like threw his notebook at me, and like every time he had like points taken off, and I was like, what's the problem? You know, maybe there's a language thing going on. And so I went and talked to the teacher, and the teacher's like, well, students have to show their work. And so if he doesn't show his work, he doesn't get the points for showing his work. Okay, but he has the right answer, like, and he can sit there in his head and do the whole answer in his head. And so being aware of the fact that oftentimes in many countries this is very typical for students to learn mathematical skills by doing it in their head. And so it was important for us to kind of break that down for Pavel and help him learn the language that went with a lot of the skills, the tasks that he was performing. And the teacher became much more accommodating of the fact that, oh, this kid can probably do calc as well as I can, so we're going to work on figuring out where that grade needs to come from. All right, so science. I think one of the most important things to think about for science is vocabulary. Science is kind of its own vocab world in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of specialized terminology. And that's a very difficult thing oftentimes for students to grasp. Again, not being able to assume that a student has had the same kind of schooling we've had in K-12. Most of us in elementary school at some time learn about the water cycle, you know, evaporation and precipitation. We can't necessarily assume that students know that vocabulary. They might know the concepts, but maybe not the vocabulary, so making sure those get matched up. And then directions in science are often multi-step. And so, you know, you might shout out to your class, okay, go to your lab station, put your glasses on, pull up this chemical, or plant this, or dissect this. And oftentimes there are a lot of different tasks that have to happen. And if you're very proficient at English, and you're kind of functioning at a 10th grade level, you might be able to catch on to that. But for somebody who isn't that proficient, that's going to be complicated for them. So being very clear or writing things out step by step, first this, second this, then this, can be very helpful for English language learners. Oh, there's some more in there, right? So I find this to happen more in science than anywhere else. But what is taught in class doesn't always match the assessment. And this happens, I think, a lot in science because we'll do things that are very engaging in terms of labs. And so students will spend a lot of time in class on lab work, but then they'll be tested on the material in the textbook. And so being very aware of the fact that students need to be sure of what you're testing them on, because they might be working really hard to pay attention to what's happening with the dissection, but then they might be tested on the system that you were dissecting, not the fact that you were cutting open a frog. So being aware of that and being able to help a student will help them be successful in the science class. So social studies, especially now with the social studies standards that have been set, there is much text to cover in social studies. It's I think, almost unreasonable in a lot of ways, where you just have to cruise through your curriculum at a very fast rate. And so keeping in mind that social studies textbooks, especially at the secondary level, have very complex sentences. Most of the students in 10th grade don't read at a 10th grade reading level, and yet their textbooks are written at a 10th grade reading level. And so being very aware of the fact that maybe there are ways that you can help a student with the text itself. Some cultures aren't accustomed to expressing personal opinion. And we ask students to do that a lot in social studies. Do you think that, I don't know, do you think that President Bush should have done this or should have done that? And that might be a really difficult thing for some students to answer because they might not be accustomed to actually being asked for their opinion. And so you might have to teach an explicit skill of how I state my opinion and what is my opinion, or what is an opinion in and of itself. And then often just the nationalistic and cultural focus of maps, where we spend a lot of time talking about this country and the people in this country without allowing for there to be a much more complex relationship between with migration, between that country and the United States. And that's a very important thing for most English language learners. If they're in your classroom, they may not need to know just about that country, but maybe if they're a people group that hates the people in that country, they might need to learn more about relationships, or they might need to learn about how this affects me now that I'm in the United States. And again, just the amount of content, and this goes for all courses, but I think with social studies it's especially important, is just being very clear about what in the text is important, what is it that you want to pull out for them to really learn. And then physical education, just being aware of various gender roles and values, religious mandates, cultural ideas about physical fitness in the body. I was working with a student teacher not too long ago, an intern, who was really struggling with the fact that he was told, okay, your students have to run so much of a distance to meet the state standard. And he had some girls in his class who wore traditional Islamic clothing, and their mom told them that they didn't have to run in gym class. And so they were refusing to run, but he said, well, you can't pass my class without running. And so just being very aware of the fact that this isn't something that we can ignore, and we can't fail students because of their cultural belief system. And so being able to negotiate a different ground there is something that's definitely possible. So keep that in mind, that maybe a student isn't doing what you're expecting of them, but there might be more to the story than just, I don't want to. All right. Questions or comments on content area? I know I didn't talk about world language. I think one thing for world language teachers to keep in mind is that oftentimes you are called upon as the resource of language. Since you teach Spanish or French or German in our school, you must know everything there is to know about Burma. And chances are that's not necessarily true, but I've seen that happen so often that if you speak another language, then you must be the expert. So just being aware of these things so that you can be a resource in your school, I think, is very helpful. Comments or questions on this? I know it was quick, lots of information. Okay. So, something that I think I know was helpful for me as an English language teacher working with my content area teachers in my school was when it comes down to it. If you have students in your classroom who are just trying to survive high school, and you know they're not going to learn all of the concepts you have laid out for the entire year, thinking about unit per unit, what are the 3 most important concepts I want this student to learn, or what are the 5 most important concepts? If they're only going to learn 3 or 5 things, what are the most important things for them to learn? And sometimes I know for myself as a teacher, it's really hard to let go of that because I want to say, well, all kids should learn all 15 things on my list. But the reality is this student doesn't necessarily have those language skills at this time to go at the pace that I want to go. And so if I choose those very most important concepts or skills, what are they going to be? And so that might be helpful for you in thinking about, okay, I know this student isn't necessarily going to learn all of them,